Johnny Wink and Eric Brownderville, welcome to the Greg Brownderville Dimension.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Good to have my brother Eric with me for the first time on the podcast. Thanks for stopping by, Eric.
Glad to be here. Glad to be here with you and Johnny.
We are here on the campus of Ouachita Baptist University, where Johnny teaches English, a place that's near and dear to my heart because I went to school here. And we are in a room called the Pretty Room. And Johnny, do you have any favorite Pretty Room memories?
I do. I like it, especially back in the days when it was rightly called the Pretty Room. It was called that because it had a beautiful view. And then along came the administration and walled us in, just like the character in the Poe story. And so we were a little upset about that. But they gave us bells and whistles, and it is a pretty room. And we actually had a student come along, and you can look over there, and you see a painting she did. And it is like a Magritte painting. It's a painting that shows what has been blocked out. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And that's a great memory of what this room looked like when it was a room with a view. Yeah.
This room's always been so special to me. And I've paid visits to Ouachita frequently through the years. And I was through here when they were working on this place and walling in that beautiful window.
Right.
When it was under construction and kind of a neither this nor that state. I don't know if they were sheetrocking or what. The window was blocked off by then. There was something blocking the window. And I don't know who it was, if it was you or another English professor or a student, but somebody had come in here and written a couple of lines from an Emily Dickinson poem. I heard a fly buzz when I died. It said, "And then the windows failed.
Oh,
and then
I forgot
could
that.
Not see to see."
That's wonderful.
It was a great use of those Dickinson lines, I thought.
It's this is a room that that matters immensely to me too, because it is a room in which some of the most precious friendships of my life were formed. When Greg came down here just to talk about whether he wanted to come to Ouachita, he was planning to go to Fayetteville. I first met Greg and talked with him in this room.
Well, I've heard that story.
Yeah.
So this is the actual room.
This is the room. And in the spring of 2010, in this room, I had a student in two courses, Shakespeare sonnets that Jay Curlin and I taught together, and creative writing. Student's name is Eli Craner, and he's come to be one of the dearest friends I have in the world. He's good friends with Greg and a fine writer. And it all started in this, and I could give other instances of really dear friendships to me that had their beginning right here.
I had a student ID card at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville.
Yeah.
Had gone through student orientation.
Right.
And I thought, let me go visit Ouachita because I really liked that conversation I had with a fellow named Jeff Root. When the University of Arkansas called me to recruit me, it sounded like somebody with a list of names and a script, and it was like a telemarketing call almost. Mm-hmm. But when Jeff Root called, it was like your uncle called you or something.
Yeah. Jeff Root is one of my best friends. And he's not a guy I socialize with a lot, but he's somebody that's very, very dear to me. He's a wonderful boss. He's the dean of our school, and he's a wonderfully witty man. His father actually is on record as having been Bill Clinton's favorite teacher. And so his dad, Paul, who's now dead, once got pretty famous for a while because all these presidents were polled about their favorite teachers. And Paul Root and Paul had a magnificent sense of humor, as does his son, Jeff. So there are all kinds of reasons that I'm glad I know Jeff Root. And there are all kinds of things I'm grateful to him for, both professionally and personally. But if I'm mentioning, or if I'm thinking about the single greatest gift he ever gave me, it was this guy, this brother of yours, because had it not been for Jeff, Greg would never have found us. And
That's great, because this place changed Greg's life. I know.
So that's.
And it started right here in this room. I remember I was sitting in that chair, had a conversation with Johnny, and I thought, this is where I'm going to go. And then Johnny was my teacher and friend, and really we had struck up a friendship before that, writing old-fashioned
letters,
post office
that
letters
actually came in the mail. Yeah.
I was listening to that other podcast, and just because I know you so well, Greg, and I don't know you that well, Johnny, but there's a sound in Greg's voice like he's with almost like kinfolks or something when he's talking to you. It's just the way he laughs, a sound in his voice. So it was good to hear that.
Right.
I knew how close y'all were just from hearing the tone in his voice.
I'm glad that came across in that podcast. Yeah.
Yeah,
because it is the truth of it. Yep.
And it felt like home just sitting here talking to Johnny that first day I came to campus, but it felt very much not like home the first day of class because I got here to the pretty room and Johnny wasn't here yet. He was the teacher of the class. It was creative writing, and you were team teaching it with Bill Ellis.
That's right,
And I was just sitting here with all the students waiting for the teachers to show up. And, you know, there I was fresh out of the country. Never really seen that much in the way of the weirdness of the arts world.
Mm-hmm.
And there were students in here with pink hair and weird clothes, saying weird things. There used to be a magazine stand, and there were all these literary magazines in there. And this guy named Rick White came in, who was real skinny, real pale skin, bald, I think, at the time, but had a real long, stiff red beard.
Stiff.
And he grabbed a copy of the New Yorker off that stand and jumped up on this table and said, "New Yorker? I hardly know her." And then jumped down and left the room. And I was like, what in the world have I gotten myself into? It felt so homey when I was here just with Johnny.
Oh, my gosh.
I'm a stranger in a strange land.
You know, my first day at ASU in my English class, it was my instructor. His name was Dr. Prigg. I don't know, this is kind of crude, but this is a big difference between my college experience and being in a nice place like this. I'm sitting down next to the wall, and I look over at the wall, and I see this graffiti written on the classroom wall, and it said, "Dr. Prigg sucks big green donkey dicks."
Oh, my gosh.
And that was my first class.
Oh, my
first
gosh, Eric.
Hey, Eric, tell Johnny about encountering one of your former teachers in a place you wouldn't have thought he would be years later.
I lived at this place in Jonesboro, kind of in the hood, really. But G Street was this street there, and there was a new business that popped up on G Street, and I couldn't tell what the business was just from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And so I walk in this place, and I soon very quickly find out it's a worldly place.
Mm-hmm.
They had various pipes and bongs and mechanisms to smoke weed, but also had a whole porno secret room with. And then the guy working there was one of my other English teachers from ASU.
One that you kind of liked, right?
Yeah, really, I liked it. His name was Wagner. I can't remember. Dow Wagner, I think, was his name. But
Oh, my God.
yeah, he had gone from. He goes. I said, "Well, this is last time I saw you. I was in your English class," and he goes, "Brownderville." I said, "You remembered?" He goes, "There's a lot more money in dildos than there is nouns."
Is that not a great line?
Oh, my goodness.
There's more money in dildos than there is nouns.
That
was
is
like,
just wonderful, man.
So, Johnny, if you ever feel like you need to take up a second career, take a page out of Wagner's book.
Absolutely, man. You never know what road is going to be beyond English. You know, I mean, you just can't know for sure.
He was the last person I thought I would find as the owner of that place.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful, man.
We're here today. I've got a big old wintertime beard, and Johnny's clean shaven, and Eric is in the grim stubble period,
Oh, my
which
gosh.
reminded me of one of your poems, Johnny.
Right.
Would you tell about that?
Yeah, well, my brother Richard, who just died last year, he died on Cinco de Mayo last year, and dear brother and a great friend of mine. And he worked, speaking about, winding up in weird places, Richard started out, he was a teacher at a military academy called Gulf Coast Military Academy. Later, he became a junior high school teacher of history. And then eventually the casinos came to the Gulf Coast, and Richard ended up becoming a blackjack dealer and mostly dealing blackjack and craps. It's funny, Richard, used to talk to me about dice, and it was like listening to Einstein talk about the general theory of relativity. It's such a complicated game, and Richard always kind of played himself down as a, not smart, really smart guy, but he was just brilliant in some areas, and like talking about craps, for instance. But he showed me a handbook, and I always loved this because, here are casinos, and of course, casinos are basically trading in people's weakness. Casinos are not, great avatars of virtue or anything, but boy, they had just a Mandarin set of rules for how the casino dealers had to behave and how they had to dress. And the one that fascinated me the most was something about how they were not to find themselves at work in what they called the stubble period. And the stubble period, you know, is where you are right now. And I said to Richard, I said, well, that if you worked regularly, that would seem to me, in effect, to mean you couldn't grow a beard, you know, because you'd have to go through the stubble period. And you know, and Richard, I think he said something like, yeah, well, if somebody wants to grow a beard, I mean, the beard isn't prohibited, but you'd have to take off for a while, you know, because you couldn't show up in the stubble period.
Well, thanks for letting me have a beard, but not letting me grow one. I mean, it's sort of...
And you know what's so weird about that too? So these, obviously, they don't want you in the stubble period. But think how fashionable that got for a while with actors. You know, I think of George Clooney, you know, and that was the way for them to present in the stubble period of all things. Yeah.
And some people figured out how they can stay in the stubble period at all times. Like Max Kellerman is a sports pundit that I sometimes watch. And he's always in the grim stubble period.
Yeah, always in the stubble period, man. Well, more power to people who want to be there.
Well, and some people clean shave, you know, they shave in the morning and by 5 o'clock they got the stubble period.
Yeah. No, Richard Nixon was sort of famous for that, for just growing his beard real fast. And that supposedly counted against him because he would do his best to kind of keep clean shaven, but he you know, it was eternal vigilance is the price of his not. And then when it turned out he was shady too, that didn't help either. So
that reminds me, I read an article in a presidential election a while ago. The writer of this article was saying that one thing that you have to become president of the United States, if you're a man, and all of them have been men, is what he called hair certainty. It doesn't mean that you have to have good hair or a lot of hair. You can be balding, but you can't be hiding anything. This whole article was about Marco Rubio because the writer said, we don't have hair certainty on Rubio. The way he's got that comb over going, maybe his hairline is actually receding quite far, but he brushes it over in a way where you can't see the hairline. And you can't be president if you're trying to hide where your hair. That's what this guy was saying. But then Trump came along, and I think maybe gave the lie to that theory. But I mean, up until Trump, maybe, according to this writer, and I'm no student of presidential history, particularly the hair of presidents, but
hair certainty.
Hair certainty.
Gosh, what? Oh, brave new world! It has such terminology in it, man. God,
I'm gonna talk to both of my boys about that.
Yeah. Well, I was starting to tell y'all in the car when we were driving earlier that I've recently come to know about a fella who changed his name legally to Beejow Doo-Doo Zappity Bop Bop Bop. And he's been in trouble with the law all through the years. And that's how I came to know about him, because these articles started popping up and then people saw the name and it seemed like a joke. But it made me think about a Johnny Wink poem called 7 Ways to Prune a Grapefruit. With that bop bop part.
And you know what drove me to write that strange poem, but that line is that Harry Johnston was this tall, very handsome guy. And I remember he had this kind of aquiline, these features. And was really, really a handsome guy. And 6'4", 6'5", and he was as vain as a human being could be as well. But he also, along with that vanity, I mean, sometimes vanity, you know, is just a complete turnoff in people, but not really with Harry. Harry had charm, and he had style. And so he comes on the bus, and he's wearing his high school sweater, and he walked with a kind of strut, you know. And actually, I just stole that line from a guy on the bus, and a guy I was always afraid of, Jack Ainsworth, who also is in the poem. But Jack sees Harry and sees Harry kind of preening and going down, and Jack just says, Harry Johnston's got his high school sweater on. Bop, bop. And that just stayed with me down through the years. And I ended up, you know, putting that into the poem. But you know what? The thing I loved about Harry's unsinkable vanity was that he was a good enough baseball player. And he was a pitcher. He had beautiful form as a pitcher, could throw pretty hard, had a pretty good curve. And so he was good enough that some people came to look at him one time, some scouts from somewhere. And so he starts the game and he gets knocked out in the first inning. You know, he can't get anybody out in the first inning. So I'm thinking, gosh, he must be just absolutely feeling disgraced. And he comes off the field, you know, after not being able to retire the side in the first inning. And he knows about these guys who are there from wherever they were from. And he said, you want to just come down to the dugout and or just down to the bullpen and watch me throw some? And they said, yeah. You know, Harry goes down there like he hadn't just been knocked out of the box and just starts warming up down there. He never really got anywhere in baseball, but he was good enough to get some people to come and watch him get knocked out of the box in the first inning.
For the benefit of our listeners, if you have it by heart, could you say 7 ways to prune a grapefruit?
Yeah, I can. And, you know, it's funny because that's the last poem, and I've only published 2 little books, one in the 80s and one in the 2016 or somewhere in there, just these 2 little volumes of poetry. But it's curious because this is the last poem, and the book was called Haunting the Wine Runner, and then a former student of mine, a guy who was studying in Scotland, I wrote a poem called Great Gray Moles, and he liked it and showed it to a friend of his. And they asked me to start sending other poems. They ended up making a book out of it. And what they wanted to call it was 7 Ways to Prune a Grapefruit. And they did. And that became, and I've always just liked the fact that I end with the poem called it, and then it becomes the title like 30 years later, you know. But yeah, so the poem just, and I've had a lot of fun with this poem through the years, showing it to students and trying to get them to write about it.
Yeah, I was one of your victims.
Were you one? Okay. I hadn't done that in a long time, but Greg was one. But he wasn't the only one. I must have done that with a half a dozen classes down through my long checkered career. But you say you start off with 7 ways to prune a grapefruit. Harry Johnston's got his high school sweater on, bop, bop. Mad Jack Ainsworth's got my ice cream cone. Roy Payne's looking for somebody his size to pick on. These are the 7 ways to prune a grapefruit. And just, you know, the fact that 4th line, what does that have to, how? But my favorite moment ever in torturing my students for that was walking around the classroom one day when I'd asked them to write about it and seeing some girl with she was sitting there with her pen and she was making little jabs at the poem, not angry ones like I want to kill this poem, but what I figured, I don't know if it's true, she was just trying to get 7 somethings out of there. You know, the darn last line in the title tells her that there are 7 things going on in here. Whatever they are, they're being called ways to prune a grapefruit, but there are 7 of them. And she was doing her darndest, man.
Because that's what you did, Dutch. You said, okay, I'm going to say this poem to y'all, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me the 7 ways.
Oh, good. Okay.
So I bet you had done that.
Yeah, I guess I directed her that way. She was looking, man, doing the best she could.
So do you reveal to the class that there's, or do you?
I don't. I just generally kind of I would just have them write and and give it back and not really say anything like, well, I don't know what this was getting at. But in the last couple of years, I've really gotten fascinated with, and I've especially been fascinated with it recently because I ordered me a new volume of Wallace Stevens poems because mine had just fallen apart. And what it is that I keep thinking, here I am. I've been in this business all these years. I'm a licensed, English teacher, a trained professional, as it were, I've got a BA and an MA and a PhD, but a student could come up to me and walk in here right now and say, hey, by the way, I've just been reading this poem by this guy named Wallace Stevens called The Cuban Doctor. Could you help me with it? And I couldn't. I mean, I wouldn't have a clue as to tell her what that poem was about. And what I've got to thinking about am thinking about now is, could they get you for malpractice? I mean, like doctors, they can get doctors. This guy, this joker's, he's a chaired professor at this college, and he can't help me one little bit with a Cuban doctor.
After wearing out that Wallace Stevens book to the point he had to buy a new one.
I know it. So here's the guy who's got a kind of a strange fixation with Wallace Stevens. But there are some poems I think I could talk to you about by Wallace Stevens, and then there are some I couldn't. And so I ended up writing a poem that was in that second book, the book that they picked up in Scotland, and it's called "The Poem Was Headed Straight for Him." And in that poem, a guy has a nightmare in which there's a poem and something strange is going on. There's a fat man dead in a bathtub with a candle in his left ear, and there's a creamsicle in it, and he's dreaming that this poem is barreling toward him, and it's just going to run him over. And that's then my anxiety, and it is a genuine anxiety, really about sometimes just not knowing what's going on in something I'm reading.
I'm so glad you brought up Wallace Stevens, because I've been thinking about you and Wallace Stevens today because of something that happened. So our listeners won't know anything about this, so I'll fill them in. Johnny's 20-year-old cat, Silky, died last night. And actually before this podcast, we went and buried the cat. And Johnny had told me about this, so I was thinking about it on the drive from Dallas to Arkadelphia, Arkansas today. I was listening to a podcast put out by this bunch called Unheard in London. And they had a guest on the podcast named Silky Carlo.
Oh, my.
And then I stopped and decided I was going to buy me a candy bar and got a Dove candy bar, and it said Silky on the front of the package. It took me back to something that happened in Missouri some years ago. It was my first teaching job right out of grad school in Jefferson City, Missouri. And one day, I came across a reference to the Blue Fugates, who are these people in Kentucky along Troublesome Creek who are blue. It's this family called the Fugates. They call them the Blue Fugates because they're blue.
Yeah.
And then I went online and read about them, and there was this woman telling about, Marvin Fugate came over here the other day with his mama, and we was visiting in the living room, and Marvin just kind of slunk down in the hall against the wall and looked down. You could tell it really bothered him to be blue. And it was all this about these blue people. God. And I was just astounded.
Yeah.
And my good buddy came to my office that day, and I said, I don't know what you came here to talk about, but all I can think about is this thing I just found out about today, the Blue Fugates. Do you know about this? And it does sound like the kind of thing I would make up. Right. And he said, I'm sure, Greg, it's blue people in Kentucky. You're not fooling me. And I said, I completely understand why you would think this is something I made up, but I'm telling you, look it up. He's like, I'm not going to look it up. So the plan was for him and me to go to Columbia, Missouri, which is 30 miles away, that evening to see our good friend, the poet Melissa Range, give a reading. When I got to his house that evening, he wasn't quite ready. So I sat in the living room, was visiting with his wife. And she said, well, how's your day been, Greg? And I said, all I can think about is the Blue Fugates. I found out about them. And so I started to tell her. She said, oh, yeah. And she rattled off this 33-syllable word for the medical condition. She's a physician. She said, I know all about them. We had some of those blue people come in to the hospital when I was working in Arkansas.
Is it like colloidal silver or something that does it?
Don't get me to lie.
Get me to lie.
So she said, yeah, I've treated people, those blue people in Arkansas. And about this time, my friend walks in and hears her say blue people, and he's like, is he trying to fool you with this thing about the blue people? And I said, ask your wife, the trained physician, about the blue people. She's like, don't you remember those blue people in Arkansas? So it's already getting weird. My whole day is revolving around the fact of these blue people. Then we get in the car, drive over to Como, Columbia, Missouri, for this reading. First thing that happens is we walk into this beautiful art gallery called Orr Street, where the reading was going to be, and go say hi to Melissa. So I came up and greeted her, and she said, I want to introduce you to my good friend. And it turns out this girl was from Kentucky, and her last name was Fugate. And I looked down, and there is this bluish woman.
Wow.
Looking at me. And I tried not to be obvious about it, but I guess I looked at her in kind of a sort of too interested in her appearance kind of way or something.
Right.
And she said, I know what you're thinking. I'm not a blue Fugate. And I said, I'm sorry. Do you get that all the time? She goes, no, I don't. You're the first person in the state of Missouri to know about it and to ask about it. I'm wearing a blue shirt and it's throwing off a little blue glow on my skin. I'm not blue.
God.
I mean, I found out later that she's not blue. Like, it really was just a blue shirt. And then Melissa gives a reading. And our mutual friend, Christina Ngoli, is like, let's all go outside and get a picture made to celebrate Ranger's reading. So we go outside and back up against this random bar out there. And I look up above me. And there's a sign, and the name of the bar was the Blue Fugue. And I'm like, the God of this universe is not too good to take up a little bit of time just to be playful and silly. You know, I don't know, whatever else he's doing, whatever else God is doing.
Yeah.
He is doing stuff like this Silky business today and the Blue Fugate stuff that day. And it made me think about this silliness that's just flourishing at the heart of being and at the heart of the universe that I feel like your poetry and Wallace Stevens captures and conveys. You get that, and it comes through in your poetry, that essential playfulness or silliness of creation itself, of the universe itself, of being. And I was thinking about that today. So when you brought up that you got that Wallace Stevens book and have worn it to shreds, it felt exactly right for this day.
Man, not only do you guys bury my cat for me, you make me feel so good saying something like that, man. It takes a wonder village. You know, that's what I say. It takes a wonder village. I'm so glad you guys are here. Yeah. Yeah, man.
I don't know why this made me think of this, but when Greg and I both moved back to Pumpkin Bend to work on music after we had both graduated college, we spent a lot of time in a routine of writing songs and recording songs and working on songs. And inevitably, at some point in the middle of the night, we'd be working on songs, and I'd decide I want a bowl of Cocoa Krispies. And I would go make these Cocoa Krispies. And Greg one night comes up to me, and I'm not going to be able to see this, but he just takes his hand like this and comes up on my back and just presses it like that. And this went on every time I made a bowl of cereal for like 2 months, until finally one day I'm making my cereal and he pushes me so hard it almost knocks me into the counter. And I said, dude, what are you doing? He goes, finally, I've been waiting for you to say something about this. I've been doing this to you every day. I said, I know you've been doing it.
And why were you doing it, Greg?
I just like doing ridiculous, silly things and
Right.
just seeing how long it'll take for somebody to call me on it.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
my God.
I actually did that very early in knowing you, Johnny. You were helping me get my schedule set up one semester because you were my advisor.
Right.
And I decided ahead of time that I was going to talk about gen ed a lot. It was my first year, and so I was having to think about getting my gen ed classes squared away, general education. But I was going to say business ed over and over. just see what you would do.
Oh,
I don't think I've
man.
ever told you this.
You never did.
And you were very polite. I mean, you would find ways to say gen ed a couple sentences later after I had made the errors so I could hear it and catch on to it.
Right.
And I would come back and say, well, I'm about to have my business ed knocked out here. And it just went on like that, and then that was the end of it.
Right.
So
That reminds me of something that happened today. I'm teaching a course in linguistics, and we got on to the fact that if a Russian person learning English gets really good at English, but one of the last things that the Russian will be able to master is something that seems simple to the three of us, and that's just using the words a and an and the, because Russian doesn't have articles. It gets by fine without them. And because we plug them in, like I might say, I'm going to the store, but then I'd also say I'm going to class or I'm going to bed. So sometimes we got the there, sometimes we don't. There's no real rhyme or reason for it. Mm-hmm. So on kind of Greg's principle of punching on you, you know, when you would make the cereal, my brothers and I would say, to try to just make our parents raise their eyebrows, I think I started this, and my other two brothers joined me. I would say at night, well, I'm going to the bed. And I would just throw that. And I don't know what my mom and dad did, whether they just soft pedaled it but I think at some point, my son, why are you Like you said,
the
the bed.
You know, my grandma did say the bed. She'd say, "Is Eric still in the bed?"
Yeah.
She would do it. My
Well,
Mimi on my mama's
I
side.
can see it in that. Is Eric still in the bed?
Yeah.
But I don't think it never occurred to us to say in the phrase, I'm going to.
Yeah, you're right.
You know, I'm going to
Yeah.
bed, you know. But we came upon that one day. We just hit upon the fact that it really would seem, and apparently for the Russian, that's just a nightmare because when do you use the and when
Sometimes
don't
we
you,
do,
you know?
And
Sometimes
sometimes there'll be that difference between Brits and Americans, like with hospital and university.
Exactly.
I was just thinking of that university.
That's
for
right,
sure.
yeah.
We were in hospital. Or
We were
my
in
sister's at university.
At university, right, yeah.
Or at uni, as they
At
often
uni,
say.
at uni.
Speaking of Mimi, another funny thing Greg did is he went around asking everyone for a month or two a couple questions. He would say, what's your favorite non-color? And another one he would ask
Tough
is,
question.
what's your three least favorite names for a boy? And he would ask everyone these questions. But Mimi gave him a great one about the names.
Yeah, most people don't have an answer to what's your least favorite name for a boy.
Right.
Because people have only thought about their favorites.
Favorites, right, sure.
And so people would get puzzled and they kind of look at me quizzically and squint. One person said Todd. One person said Courtney. One person said Madison. But almost everyone had to pause and think about it.
Mm-hmm.
But one day I was over at my grandma's house, my Mimi's house. It was long about supper time. And I was sitting over there at her dining table and had the chair turned around. I was straddling the back of the chair and watching her cook. She was standing over a skillet with that skillet hissing. We weren't really even talking. She was just cooking. I was watching her. And I said, Mimi, what's your least favorite name for a boy? And Buddy, with no hesitation, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for somebody to ask her that question, she wheeled around at me and said, Lester, Chester, Jethro, and Jasper.
Craig. What did you think, Craig?
I was like, these are ex-boyfriends, like the men that broke her heart or the ones that weren't good enough to break her heart? I don't know what it was. She gave me four. I guess it was a four-way tie for the worst. But
Yeah, Lester, Chester,
Jethro and Jasper.
Jasper. Oh, my God. Oh, my
Jasper.
gosh. That is wonderful.
And you know Mimi, while we're on the topic of her, something happened between me and her that gets at this idea we were talking about earlier about the playfulness or the silliness at the heart of life.
Mm-hmm.
All the time I was growing up, it seemed like it happened around Mimi a lot. I would get in this state, and it's sometimes associated with sleep deprivation. Not always, but sometimes, where just everything would seem funny to me, as if I'd taken a drug or something. And it's just a joyful, wonderful state of mind to get into.
Is that what we used to refer to as the simples?
That's what she would say. She'd say, somebody's got the simples. Or, honey, you got the simples. That was her phrase for it.
Yeah.
And I just thought, that's just what we call it in Pumpkin Bend, the simples, when you feel like that. And I love getting the simples.
Right.
There is a magic to it. And Mimi died in 2008 when she and I were real close.
What month did she die?
November.
Because my mama died in October of 2008. Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah.
Right close to each other.
Yeah.
That was a real loss to me. I remember I was living in Missouri, that first teaching job right out of grad school, and drove home, of course, and for the funeral, and then had to go back by myself to Missouri. And I remember I stopped somewhere and like used the bathroom, whatever. And I was in the bathroom and I saw my face in the mirror. And looking at myself in the mirror, I thought, you're more alone tonight than you've ever been. Because there aren't going to be that many people that love you the way Mimi loves you, the way I knew she loved me. And I thought, it's a short list and one of them's gone tonight. And I felt I was hurtling through the dark cold of outer space. And after that, she started coming to me in dreams. They did not feel like other dreams, and this is still happening. There was one where I saw her outdoors in this hilly area with all this comic machinery, as if you had gone to 1,000 county fairs and gotten all the machinery from the rides and just Frankensteined them together into these colorful contraptions that are churning ridiculously in the background, creating a feeling. And it was the feeling of that silliness, that wonderful, blessed silliness. And she just looked over at me and smiled. And it was like a mystical feeling, like a mystical glow to her face. And then the next one We were in her kitchen, same place where she told me Lester, Chester, Jethro, and Jasper. And we were sitting there at her counter. It's interesting. I can have a kind of conversation with Mimi in these dreams that I was never able to have with her in life, because she would often stiff-arm conversations that were the least bit philosophical.
Oh, yeah?
Mimi wanted things to be.
Right.
Here's what on Tuesday we had the fried pie sale. On Wednesday, Matt came to visit. It was about stuff that provably happened. That's what she wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
But in these dreams, she'll talk about other things. And I said, Mimi, I just want to tell you, I'm so grateful to you for teaching me about the simples. That's one of my favorite things in life. And if you hadn't named it or told me the name, I don't know that I would have that in the same way.
Right.
And she said, you're very welcome, honey, but there's something you're missing, that you've kind of missed the boat on this a little bit. There's an extra dimension of meaning to the simples that's spiritual, and you need to look into that. That got me thinking. About 2 weeks later, I was reading some of Yeats's prose, in which he talked about how the Irish peasants would use herbs and things to effectuate outcomes in their lives, sometimes emotional, sometimes in their life circumstances. And these herbs and things were called simples. That kind of gave me a glimpse into what may be the etymology of the thing. I don't know, but this idea that
herbs and simples.
it's like a mojo in the Delta, or like what the old people would call tobies, talismanic bundles, and that there's something about the simples that's magical and mystical. And she had told me to be on the lookout for that in that dream. Ain't that something?
Yes.
And I think it's something about this Wallace Stevens, Johnny Wink thing in the universe.
I've seen her in dreams before too. Nothing as profound as that, but I do remember, not to just dwell on about Mimi, but you said she would always try to, if you got too far out there, she didn't have much tolerance for looking outside the box. But about 10 years before she died, this was probably in the late 90s when I was in college, and I was over at her house spending time with her, and we actually talked about, we had this conversation, do you think when people pass that they could pass a message to the living somehow? Because you hear stories like that, especially around there for sure. And she was open-minded to the idea, and we made a pact that day that she would probably die before me, and when she did, if she had the ability to communicate with me from beyond the grave, that she would.
Oh, God.
And at that time in my life, I was like, yes. But then in about 2007, I was back over at her house, and I'd forgotten all about this conversation. And just out of the blue, she said, Eric, honey, when I die, do you still want me to try to come back and visit you after I die?
How about that?
And in that moment, I was like, no, I think I changed my mind. But I should have said yes. When she died.
She was thinking about it.
Brought it up out of the blue, and I hadn't thought about that in all those years.
That's an amazing story.
Man.
I didn't know about that.
And for her to, she usually wasn't too tolerant of things like that, but that somehow.
But that sort of narrativizes the abstract. A ghost story, that's okay, because that's a happening. It makes it physical. The ghost comes in your house. I've collected a lot of ghost lore back home. And what I've noticed is if you ask people, describe a soul to me, they imagine this whitish, body-shaped thing that's kind of wispy and airy. You put your hand through it kind of thing. But if you say ghost, ghosts wear clothes and have accents.
Yeah. I was thinking about something as you were talking about I got to thinking about words and how something will put a word on the map for me. Now, this isn't true of many words, but there are probably maybe 100 words all told, and maybe not even that many, that if Eric were just to say this word to me casually, I would go to something I've read because some writer put that word on the map for me. And I wanted to mention a couple of things in connection with that. Greg said at some point he used the name Madison. And I've always thought that was a pretty name, but I've never been obsessed by it. I've never really known a Madison well. But that word all of a sudden just was on the map for me. And do you have any idea, Greg, why it is?
Is it Welcome to the Old Cathedral?
Is that about the restaurant?
Yep.
Yeah. Greg wrote that. I couldn't remember the title, right? But it's a poem that just haunts me. It's a poem of his I've gone over and over, and I just sometimes find myself muttering, "Madison will be your server, man."
And the reason I put that in there is that my friend, the musician Dent May, when I asked him the question, your least favorite name for a boy, he said Madison, and that was fresh on my mind, and that's why I put it in that poem. And also, that poem owes its closing line to Johnny's son Gene.
The faith will be your waitress. I was wondering if it was in the same.
What was this? What did you?
I came years ago along with a friend of mine named Lisa Robichaux. We came to town and we're hanging out, and we all went, Gene, Johnny's son, Johnny, Lisa, and I, to this catfish house here in Arkadelphia. And we sat down, and this middle-aged guy came over to our table right after we got good sit down and said, Faith will be your waitress. She'll be over here in a minute. Y'all just make yourselves comfortable. And Gene and I were sitting by each other, and we looked at each other and repeated the line in unison, Faith will be your waitress.
Oh, man.
And I remember Gene said, that could be the name of a film. Man, it's just beautiful. I might write a song called that. It sounds like the name of a Leonard Cohen song.
Yeah, it does.
But it wound up going in that poem.
Right. Another thing, this is recompense for y'all's wonderful helping me bury my cat today. And it has to do with when you said something about, you used the word funeral. And I just wanted to throw this out to you. Greg, Susan and I used to talk about Greg and how he seemed never to forget anything anyone had said. This wonderful ability to listen.
I know this well.
And yeah, as you would, better than we did. But Susan said, as much as I like Greg, that kind of unnerves me. And I said, why is that? And she says, well, I do the best I can, but I say a lot of things in class that I end up thinking are kind of stupid. And he's going to remember every one of them, along with the smart things that I've said, But if Greg's heard this before, he'll remember it. But way back in the Once Upon a Time, I was teaching with a program called Upward Bound, and we would have students come in the summer, and I would teach. And there was a guy from the Delta, and he was a big, sweet guy. He was a football player, and he couldn't spell well at all. And so there were two things that I came away from my experience with this. Well, actually three things that happened. One, I was playing pickup basketball with him and some others one time, and he was, like, say, a sweetheart, but he just in the course of the game, he hit me and knocked me into the cheap seats in the gym. And he was so alarmed, he thought he'd killed his English teacher. And I remember his grabbing for me and said, "Are you all right, Mr. Dr. Wink?" Mr. And I love that. But I love even better the other two things. One of them is that I asked my students one day just to talked to them about similes and said, just say somebody is like something and say why. And so Eddie Ray said, Dr. Wink is like the sun. This is what he wrote. He has, and he then said and he got bright smile. He was trying to write bright. He has a bright smile on his face, a good simile. Dr. Wink is like the sun. He's got a bright smile on his face. But he mangled bright and smiling. I'm not making this up. It came out, he has birth slime on his face. Had you ever heard that one?
No, it's
okay.
Great.
I'm glad. I'm glad that's a gift to you as well as Eric. But the other thing that in a way isn't as good as that, but is in a way for me better because it's haunted me, y'all. I mean, I thought about it today in connection with Silk when we were burying him. I've thought it every time I've been at a funeral. And it was just an incredible misspelling on Eddie's part of the word funeral. And he was writing about a guy going to his father's funeral, and he said he went to his father's Fentona, Fentona.
Fentona.
I don't know how it came, but I know it's haunted me. So that I've never been in a funeral. I thought when I was at my own father's funeral, I thought, my God, I'm at my father's Fentona now. And I don't even tell that story anymore. The reason I'm telling y'all is I know about the kind of weird fascination with just words for their own for whatever strange reasons.
That gives it a kind of redolence of carnival. It makes the funeral seem more celebratory.
Yeah, Fantona, man. I was just talking about Greg to a dear student of mine, a girl named Sydney Whitfield, and I'm having them keep journals in linguistics. And Sydney is one who loves to fall in love with a word. And a word that she fell in love with last semester in another class of mine was brutal. And she just loved the word brutal. And she would use it she would say things like, boy, trying to parse that absolute phrase in that sentence was brutal. Everything was brutal in grammar, And and I told her then the story that Greg had told me about loving the word Swiss when he was a boy and trying to steer the conversation around, so that the social studies teacher would use the word Swiss.
Was it what teacher was it?
Sandy Gaskins.
Oh,
and I did it around Mama too. And Mama, she was wise to my weird ways.
Yeah.
Because Swiss, it doesn't come up naturally in Pumpkin Bend just all that often. And I would be like, Swiss Army knife, Swiss rolls, Swiss cheese. And finally, Mama looked at me and said, oh, honey, you're just looking for reasons to use the word Swiss.
Which had to delight you getting your mama to use the word Swiss.
Exactly.
you still love the word Swiss.
Oh, yeah, I love the word Swiss.
He's never given up on the word Swiss. I mean, whatever else happens in life.
It's always there for me.
It's always there for you, man. I tell you what.
Still use a Swiss Army knife, and I call it my Swiss.
You got me a Swiss Army knife for Christmas last year that I carry around.
And you know that we've come full circle on something here, because when I was a student at Ouachita, Johnny didn't pull me aside, but we were talking, just the two of us one day, and he said, Greg, what do you think about this phrase everybody's saying about so-and-so was always there for me? It's almost kind of scary. It's parasitic at some point. This person is just
hovering.
Yeah, like the waiter that won't leave you alone.
Right.
Every time I hear somebody say it, I think about you.
Right. Yeah.
And then now I edit a magazine called Southwest Review, and Johnny sent me some poems, one of which was titled
Yeah, tooth decay. Tooth decay's always been there for a moment. Yeah, right. You can count on tooth decay, just keep living. Yeah.
It's part of you.
Were you thinking of that as bookending that conversation we
had?
Yeah,
I remember that. And Eli Craner and I have picked up a similar motif, a phrase that we're both fascinated with, and Eli loves to play little games with this in his writing, is everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
And you think about, how that works and what causes people to say it, like, I associate it with tornadoes, and some place gets wiped out, some doesn't, but man, people will just say it and they mean obviously something by it. Everything happens for a reason. And Eli and I got a little game going. Sometimes we'll say, with some other people, and Eli will say everything happens for a reason and pull out a quarter and drop it and say, the reason that happened was the law of gravity.
Yeah, you're right.
Tornadoes come and blow people away. And you got to have compassion on God, because sometimes he's busy orchestrating these blue fugate moments.
Sure.
Yeah. So you can't always be stopping those tornadoes.
Absolutely.
You get one spinning like a top and then you forget about it. And over here you're orchestrating blue fugate moments and silky moments.
Yeah.
That's me in my darker moods.
Uh-huh.
But in my more optimistic moods, I think that playfulness is right there with the grief. Like today with Silky, the death of your cat's a very sad day. But then in the middle of that, Silky's popping up all over the place all day long, and it's, God is enjoying wordplay in the middle of, and then pretty soon we're enjoying it, and it's sort of consolation. The writer Alex Taylor, a close friend of mine, he and I in grad school one night got to talking about one of Johnny's poems that goes, "Sure, Jesus loves you, the undiscriminating creep, but does God?" It's like, sure, just as pestering question, like, sure, Jesus loves you, but does God love you? One night, I had brought some hickory nuts from Pumpkin Bend, and we were cracking hickory nuts with a hammer and a little pick, and we were eating those hickory nuts out of the woods of Pumpkin Bend, and had some acoustic guitars out and started singing, and we made a little country song out of Johnny's poem. The song was repetitive, and it went, "Sure, Jesus loves you, but does God love you? Sure, Jesus loves you, but does God love you? Sure, Jesus loves you, but does God love you? If he does, then why?" And you have to, in just a couple syllables, put in something unfortunate.
My God.
And I remember there was a person in the grad program that Alex did not care for, and he just put his name in at the end of the song. If he does, then why? so-and-so. One time when I was doing it, I started thinking about this tornado business. And I was like, if he does, then why send tornadoes? And Alex, he had the simples.
Uh-huh.
It was very late at night, and he had the simples. And I didn't know exactly what had seized him, but he was literally rolling in the floor. He's down on the floor cackling, and I was like, what is it? What's going on? And he goes, if he does, then why send tornadoes? And he goes, he was laughing, couldn't get the words out, and then finally he goes, the grammar. Because there's something, it's a little off, syntactically. Because it sounds like, almost like you're saying to the listener of the song, why send tornadoes?
Right,
Like
yeah.
it doesn't quite, there's something.
I see what you're saying about it being a little off, yeah. Thanks to Alex Taylor, I may be teaching the single most bizarre course I've ever taught in my life in the fall, if they'll let me. And they probably will, because it's a course that just meets once a week. It's an honors seminar, and they need people because they got so many people in the honors program here, and they need folks to teach these courses. So I think Barbara Pemberton will probably let me. Greg and Eli Craner got me on to this guy, Alex Taylor. Have you ever met him, Eric?
I think I have met Alex, when you were at Mississippi.
Y'all hit it off. I remember.
Yeah, I've never met him personally, but I've corresponded a good bit with him now. And so he's got this one story in his book that I so love, The Name of the Nearest River. And it's called something like Equator Joe's Famous Meltdown Chili. I'm getting something wrong there, but in any event, I have a kind of an obsession, and that really is almost off-putting to some of my friends because I keep talking. A former OBU, our former UARC professor, Earl Ramsey, Euler, says, I wish you'd just cool it, Johnny, about this. But it's just... It's just a grammatical construction, and it's the name it goes by is the absolute phrase, and without going into any detail at all, it's a way of putting together a kind of a phrase that lots of writers like to do. And in fact, I'm so passionate about these things that I've got like collections of favorite ones. One of my favorites, and sometimes I think it's my very favorite absolute phrase, is in mystery. Do you have any, do you know off the top of your head, any idea what it would be? And it's just such a beautiful way of saying what you're saying. My smooth, small hands roughened with glue.
You know what, Johnny? That's interesting, because I thought about that the other day. Because my hands, I thought I could put this in a poem sometime. Because my hands were so dry one day. It's like I've been working with super glue. After you've been working with super glue and you get those. And I thought, I'll put that sometime if I'm ever writing a poem and I need to make the reader really feel that feeling of dry hands, I'm going to use that. And it brought that line back to my mind.
Yeah.
And I remembered reading that poem. I had just written it, and I read it at a ceremony in Little Rock. It was at this really beautiful banquet, and Johnny came and was sitting right up close to the front, and I was saying that poem. And I got to that line, and I said it. And I remember you looking at me. You did this thing I've seen you do many times when you like something. You're like, it's like, God, like that. You never know when you write a poem, will other people get the image? The line is like, my smooth, small hands roughened with glue, I think. Isn't that it?
Yeah. I sat up half the night, my smooth, small hands roughened with glue, puzzling shards back together.
But that was a real vote of confidence for me because that was a new poem.
Right.
And I saw you react to that line. I thought, maybe I'm on the right track with this thing.
It's funny, Eric, that night, and I've told this story so often because it's the most beautiful example for me of never say never. And what it was when I introduced Greg at that thing that night, at the time, my favorite poem by him was a poem I think you've retitled it since, but he called it Never. And it's that poem about the guy embalming his high school sweetheart, and so I just didn't think anything could get better than that. I didn't know if Greg could ever write a better poem than that, or anybody else for that matter. So that was the one I said that night. I just introduced Greg, and I actually said that poem. And I think I might have said, maybe I'm just embellishing this, but something like, that's a wonderful poem. Greg will probably go on to write others better than that. But then thinking, but I don't know if he'll ever write one. And so that night he reads Mystery. And as much as I still like Never, I would give Mystery the edge. And it went through my mind that night after you finished that poem. Never say never. Never say never is your best, your favorite poem about Greg Brownderville because he might up and write mystery. I remember just begging him, as soon as you can, send me a copy of Mystery. I got it by heart. I can't teach a class anymore, or ever since then, and that's going way back, without bringing that poem in. I've had students memorize it and dance it with me, so we alternate lines, Man, oh, man.
What an honor, Johnny.
Man, what a great poem, but boy.
Mr. Kidwell was talking about, I'm sorry to change the subject here, but I don't know why I thought of this, but Mr. Kidwell, another great teacher Greg and I both had in high school, Rod.
I got to meet him once. I really liked him.
He was at the, But there was one of my buddies I went to high school with had a daughter that was in Kidwell's class at the time. And of course, they heard a lot about Greg. And these, Britt's daughter and a couple of her friends, they were real excited to come out and meet Greg because they had heard so much about him. And then we did, he decided that you would do something really weird to him when they got it. Like you would say, what was it, like hallelujah, or there was some kind of thing you were.
I think I was dropping hallelujahs in conversation.
Or something like real just subtle, until they. I don't think I lasted very long without busting out laughing.
That reminds me of the story at Eric Bickle's place.
I'm trying to think of the actual phrase. There's this guy that was like this engineer friend of ours. He was nice enough to record us.
Where was it?
Emerald Studios in Nashville, Tennessee.
In Nashville, okay.
Yeah. Super nice studio. We were really lucky to be there. Well, Eric Bickle's friend came and he had been to some supernatural thing or like a haunted house or I don't know what it was, but someone said, was it scary or was anything cool about it? He goes, well, it wasn't exceedingly paranormal. And that phrase, Greg just cast it, he just recorded it in his head. And then, fast forward about 2 hours later, we're all at Eric's house. We're staying at his house. He was nice enough to let us stay there. And the friend comes back in and Greg just takes it upon himself to go pilfering through this guy's laundry closet and finds a white sheet. And he comes out going, woo!
Oh, my God.
Look at me. I'm exceedingly paranormal.
Oh, man. Well, when Eric brought up Mr. Kidwell, that reminded me of something I wanted to ask y'all about. I wanted to ask you, Greg, whether Eric knew about this or had experience with this guy, too. One of the strangest things Greg ever told me, and I've asked many people if they have any analogous experience, but it was about your teacher who called even the girls son.
Oh, yeah.
So, Mr. Danner.
Yep.
And you'd heard him do that too, Eric, right?
He had a very specific way of talking too.
We had him on tape doing it.
Yeah, I actually, as a sixth grader, me and a couple of my friends borrowed Mimi's little micro tape recorder and hid it on his desk to see how long we could keep him off the subject of history.
Y'all had a bet with Miss Whiteside.
Yeah, we had a bet with our homeroom teacher how long we could keep him off. But finally, Nicole McDonald, she goes, Mr. Danner, do you believe in abortion? He was like, son.
that guy, he's like, son, listen. He'd always slurp too.
I remember your great imitation of it.
Listen. Yeah. He had like 5 cross pins that he kept in his shirt pocket. He would pull one out and say, son, this pen knows all the answers.
Oh my God.
What were some of his other weird things about the Empire State? He said,
yeah, he would tell a story like if you drop a penny off the Empire State Building, it would kill somebody, go straight through their head.
He said he jumped off the Empire State Building and landed on his pinky. He told us that.
He would always flicker the lights every time he entered our room, too. Like, that was his deal. Like, when he came in to teach history in our class, he would take all the lights and flick them on and off real quick.
Like a thunderstorm.
The very thing that Mom would freak out about if I did it home.
When he gets talking about Tokyo, he had been there in the Second World War. I said, what was Tokyo like, Mr. Danner? He's like, son, let me tell you. You could take McCrory, Arkansas. That's where the school was, McCrory, Arkansas. You could take McCrory, Arkansas, drop it in the middle of Tokyo and lose it. He was a card, man. We finished class early one day. So he just was sitting at his desk and letting us talk freely. And my seat was kind of close to his desk. He said, Brownderville, son, you got big weekend plans. Mind you, I'm in 6th grade. I said, yeah, Ric Flair's going to fight Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. because I was really into pro wrestling.
Oh, okay.
And because I liked all the pageantry of it and the storylines.
Right.
And so I said, Ric Flair. I mentioned Ric Flair. And he goes, the Nature Boy. So he knew his handle, his ring name.
Wow.
And he said, son, let me tell you something. 3/4 of that stuff is fake. I was like, thanks for the news flash there.
And let me tell you, Johnny, Greg, when he was a little kid, he hand created an entire he had his own wrestling federation that he dreamed up, and he created magazines, and all of his friends became a character that was a wrestler.
I remember we had a belt, several belts. The highest title was the North American champion. There was something about the modesty of that I was drawn to. You know, like not the world champ.
The North American champion.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, those belts! And like now, both of my kids went through wrestling phases. Especially Noah, he loved it for a while. And now you can buy the belts that look like the wrestling belt. Back then, you could not. And I was up in the attic about a year ago looking for something, and I found that old felt. Greg would not be stopped by this not being offered by Walmart or whatever.
My sweet mama found this seamstress that had a bunch of different materials, and she did some upholstery work and stuff, and she had this stuff that was like pleathery looking black material.
Wow.
She took me way out in the woods to this woman's house, and I got me a big old strip of that to make that belt out of.
Wow.
Daddy helped me. The plates and stuff on it was just paper, but we spray painted it with gold, like metallic gold.
Wow.
So it looked kind of shiny.
Eric, were you a character in the Federation? Did Greg make you into a?
I think maybe I was a little older and too cool to be a part of it at that time.
Right, yeah.
But I got caught in the crosshairs. As a matter of fact, this went on all the way to he was a senior because y'all did that video. One of our English teachers, Miss Eldridge, would make everyone do a video for a segment of a Shakespeare piece. And you could choose whatever you wanted. You could be creative with it or whatever. And in Greg's, it somehow broke down into all of a sudden lights went off, like disco lights were going and loud music was playing, and Greg just starts like doing like
all kind of wrestling moves. Became a wrestling match actually. Eric was the ref.
Oh yeah, I happen to have a white shirt with black stripes, so my main involvement there was to come out and like count to 3 to put. I think it was a female too that you were pinning.
Yeah, that was part of the humor of it. And then there was another scene where, just apropos of nothing, it's just complete zaniness. Macbeth is sitting around the living room one night just reading the newspaper. And Lady Macbeth is trying to get his attention to talk to him about these urgent matters in their lives that they need to attend to. But he was just distracted and wanting to read the newspaper. And he kept responding to her in this zany voice, and everything he said was alluding to cereal commercials. All those little slogans. So the whole, it was like an extended sort of montage of cereal commercials. And I remember the day we showed that in class, Ms. Eldridge, and when it was over, looked over at me and was like, talk about a Fruit Loop.
Wonderful, man.
It was cool that she did that, though. She allowed you to really just get out there with it.
Y'all had some fun up there, gosh. What were y'all? Y'all were, by virtue of going to school in McCrory, what was your mascot?
The Jaguars.
The Jaguars.
And everybody in that town pronounces it in a way that I've never heard it pronounced anywhere else. They say Jaguar.
Jaguar. Talking about individual words. And a great coincidence, great thing that happened with me and a friend of mine, guy that lives in Seattle. And I've never even met this guy, but he's become a dear friend. And just got to know him in a very quirky way. But he had sent me something. Oh, I know what it is. This guy has memorized all of Shakespeare's sonnets. And he has created something. I've been thinking about you and how you really probably want to correspond with this guy about this, that he calls a memory palace. And what he does is it's some kind of way of memorizing where I knew a guy at Ouachita who won some big contest for memorizing decimal points of pi to an ungodly number, and he did it But he said it's a dramatic thing. He said, so like the 7 here in the 50th position is like a man in a tub, and I'm walking around. And it sounds like Jeff, the guy, in Seattle, has created and so he asked Jay and me, we got to knowing him through our interest in Shakespeare. He said, do y'all want to be a particular word in Shakespeare's sonnets? And Jay voted for memory and said, yeah, I'd like to be memory. And so that whenever he gets to memory in his palace, he'll think of Jay. And I signed up for black. And I said, I like the word black, and I like variants of it, blacken. It's a word that I like a lot. And so he wrote back and said, sure, you're welcome. And I'll call you Black from now on. But I told him that one reason that I like the word so much is just like you've put words, on the map for me in your poems or absolute phrases. Well, one word that is on the map for me, thanks to Yeats, is the word blacken. And the reason it is because he uses it in this really sexy poem where this woman is talking about being a pessimist in her life. But her being a pessimist, that's part of her libido. That somehow strengthens her sexual drive. And so Yeats just hits upon this wonderful thing for her to say. She's a pessimist, and she really sometimes thinks that life, like Schopenhauer, life should never have been. On the other hand, there's sex. And she likes that too. So, well, maybe life should have been. Well, the way Yeats figures out to say this, wonderfully is, she says, how could passion run so deep? Had I never thought that the crime of being born blackens all our lot. But where the crime's committed, the crime can be forgot. So I send this to Jeff. And as an example of one reason I like the word black and blackened and variants. And I get the most wonderful letter back from him. He says, Johnny, I sat down and I was looking at my computer and I'm reading this wonderful poem I'd never seen before. And my wife comes up to me and she starts rubbing my back and I read her this. And then he said, ... and he says, thanks. That is so wonderful, man. Oh my gosh.
That's awesome.
But where the crime's committed, the crime can be forgotten.
It's kind of a companion line in a way to that Love has pitched his mansion in the place of excrement.
Right, yeah.
When you were talking about baseball earlier, Johnny, it made me think about a story you told me years ago that I've always wished you could tell Eric about the anatomical anomaly that one of your teammates was cursed with.
I will gladly tell Eric this story. I had a friend named Butch Marshall who he ended up being a pilot. He was, I think, a pilot a supply pilot in Vietnam, and he was a Delta pilot, and just as good a guy as you'd ever want to know. I actually saw him about 15 years ago after thinking I'd never see him again, him and his wife. His wife's a fine writer. His name is Butch Marshall, and he was very handsome in a kind of a pretty boy kind of way. He had curls, curly hair, and was a fine athlete. He played left field on our baseball team. So one time we were going to play against Biloxi, and Biloxi, these kind of rough guys from 14 miles east of us. I happened to know some of these Biloxi guys. I forget even how, but they were kind of louts in some ways, So these guys are, it's before the game, and I'm over in their dugout, and they're ragging on Butch Marshall. He's catching flies in the outfield practicing. And they're calling him Pretty Boy, Pretty Boy, Romeo, and just kind of getting on him for just being handsome, in a sort of a pretty way, and they're giving him a hard time. So I say, I know it's the kind of way we are, the way we tease people, but, you ought to kind of play down the things you're saying about him and being effeminate and everything, because the fact of the matter is it was just a congenital thing, but because for congenital reasons he didn't have a penis, and they look at me suspiciously, and a guy named Joey Pomeranski says, yeah, wink, it's just some of your bullshit, and did this and that and the other, and he's giving me a hard time, and all of a sudden I realized they weren't buying this at all, and I knew what I could do to make them buy it. It just came to me like a gift from the Lord. It really did. And it worked. And here was the deal. These were tough guys, and I was never a tough guy. I was afraid of guys from Biloxi. And they knew it. I mean, they knew I wasn't a tough guy. They knew I wasn't a fighter. I had thick glasses, and so they knew that I was not a brave person. And that was how I knew I could sell this. Because I looked, and Joey Pomeranski was a tough guy. And I just looked at him, and I said, "Okay, Pomeranski, you don't believe me. Go ahead, think this is just bullshit. Go ahead, Pomer. But by God, Pomeranski, if you say anything to him about this, I don't know how I can get you, man." And I just flew into his face. Just gambling that he didn't just punch me out. I mean, it was righteous indignation. And they looked at me, and Pomeranski looked and said, "I'm not going to say anything, man. Just, I'm not going to say anything." And I knew right then. And they shut up completely. So time went on. It got to be the fourth, fifth inning, and Butch was over there. And Butch says, "Man, those guys, they were laying on me. And then you were over there, and they just stopped." And how'd you get them to stop it? I said, "Well, Butch, difficult times call for difficult measures." And but how'd you? And I kept, stringing poor Butch along. And I said, "Well, I just finally said, I just told him you didn't have a penis, man." and that's when I thought Butch was going to turn Pomeranski and be, "You told him I didn't have a penis." And I don't know how I got through that, but somehow I survived.
Did y'all stay friends after that?
Huh? Yeah, we actually did. And I'm not sure why, because Butch could have really done, but he was a real sweethearted guy, and maybe he didn't even quite believe I'd told him that, but they had shut up all of a sudden pretty dramatically, and through the game, they weren't ragging him anymore,
What was it that came over you that allowed you to get real,
Yeah, I think that even though I'm not a brave person, and I'm not likely to be courageous, but it's going back to something that I think, Greg, the simples, and the fact that there is something magical in trying to do something like that, in trying to make the world change really dramatically, like get these guys from Biloxi of all places to shut, and there was just something, I couldn't resist it. And so for that moment, I took a chance on being pummeled by Pomeranski, because that was worth it. It seemed somehow to try to pull this off on these guys,
And Pomeranski, I mean, you can almost see
Joey Pomeranski, man.
It's like a character.
Man.
That reminds me, too, that sister-in-law story you told, just about great names, that Brother Spookendike. That name, that's perfect.
I've just written a poem. I finally found a poem to put this in, but...
Yeah?
Yeah, there was a stock character, and the name is Brother Spookendike. Sister-in-law would sometimes use it. I've heard country preachers use it sometimes. Spookendike is a sort of a hellfire and brimstone.
How would you spell the name?
I think I spelled it Spookendike.
Okay.
You could say Dyke.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Spookendike. Yeah. It's a good name.
Man. Did you know sister-in-law, Eric?
No, I don't think I ever met her. But I mean, Greg and I were around back home at that same time,
right?
When he was collecting those stories, and he talked about her a lot,
right?
And her son just passed away.
Yeah, something just happened the other day, Johnny. I got to think about sister-in-law and her son Larry, who's such a nice guy. He was the one that worked with us to get her art collection housed here at Ouachita.
Yeah.
And for our listeners, sister-in-law was a folk artist from Patterson, Arkansas, and she was just a remarkable human being, one of the most important mentors in my life. Her whole house was full of folk art.
Mm.
And like I've said, to walk into that house was like walking into her imagination. And then she had a bunch of outbuildings full of her art.
Mm-hmm.
And one called the Upper Room and one called the Playhouse. And that Playhouse captured some of this same thing we've been talking about. That sense of play that will stay with you if you will stay with it. If you don't give up on it, it won't give up on you.
Yeah, you put it beautifully, man.
And sister-in-law, she's just, I could go on about her all day, but Larry, her son, was so kind to me. He's a good musician. We played music together. He got to be friends with Eric and Dad, and we all played gospel music together sometimes. And the other day, I just got to thinking about him, so I wrote him. He liked to message on Facebook, so I went on Facebook and I wrote him. I said, "Hi, Larry. Happy New Year to you. I was just sitting here tonight, and the memory came back to mind of the day we met for the first time out at your mama's place in Patterson. I remember standing out there in the Arkansas sun like it was yesterday. I can't believe that was 22 years ago. Seems completely impossible to me that so much time has passed. Anyhow, just reminiscing a little. Hope you're doing well, my friend." And a couple of days go by and no response, and that was unusual because he's pretty quick on the draw when it comes to electronic communications. And then a few days later, his wife messaged me back and said, "Hi, this is Louise, Larry's wife. Larry passed away September 10th at 7:18 p.m. He loved you and your family and spoke of you often. He really appreciated all you did for his mom. Warm regards, Louise Law." So it's just a sad thing of it. He left us and I didn't know because they lived up in Indiana, and just too far apart to see each other with any regularity. And
I wanted to run something by you guys that just what Greg said. This has to do my linguistics class again, and just get your input on this and your own experiences with this. So we were talking today about the fact that in China, when Susan and I went there for the first time in 1992, we would notice that some buildings didn't have a fourth floor, the way some don't have a 13th, because of bad luck. And we learned that the logic for that was that in Mandarin, the word for four is pronounced something like this, to the best of my feeble ability, something like sure. And that word is very close in sound to a word that means death. And it's close enough that there was enough of a sense that, so you kind of try to avoid that number, in like buildings. And I don't know how wide that would extend. Well, on the same page, there's talk in the book about Aboriginal peoples in Australia and how they will sometimes have shared languages. So you'll be able to talk. It's a different language, but you'll be pretty good at your native language, and you got B and C. And because there is that possibility of moving back and forth, here comes the weird taboo. If somebody in your tribe dies, and that somebody's name is is whatever it is, and it may be associated with another word, sometimes words will be dropped out, and replaced with, say, from the other language. And so you're tabooing the name of the dead person, which seems really bizarre to me. But here's what I got to thinking about. So we got the word die. And now for me, is not a taboo. I can say my wife died in 2019, or my cat died yesterday. But I know people who can't. And they're not going to say die. They're going to say pass, or pass away, or pass over, or pass. And so what I'm wanting from y'all is your own experience of that. Are you going to say die, or are you going to go for something else? And the way that those Aborigines will push the word aside because it's a little too strong. And the people that you've known in your lives, do people pass more or do they die?
I think I've probably would say pass away, but that's kind of just because I feel like it's more acceptable to other people.
Sure.
Probably. Like if it were just me and Greg talking or something, I'd probably say die.
Right.
I've thought about this, and I try to read the other person.
Right.
Because I do get the idea that some people would consider it harsh.
Right.
Indecorous or harsh.
Right.
Yeah. Disrespectful almost. It's like, not that you're disrespecting the dead. You're disrespecting the grief of the living.
Right. And I've been sensitive to that too. I mean, I'll be in certain environments where I'm sorry your mother died. I would go with pass. Yeah.
But just as there are people who will not like died to be used in that instance, there are people who will be insulted by passed away.
Exactly.
Because they feel that you don't credit them with the strength of spirit to handle the harsh reality of the thing.
Right.
And I remember one time years ago, I was talking to somebody, an old friend that had fallen out of my life and hadn't talked to in a long time. And then he'd come back into my life, and I asked him how his family was doing. It came across to me that his dad had died. And I was asking myself, okay, here's one of those moments. I'm about to acknowledge this death. Which phrase am I going to use? And I thought, this is the kind of person who doesn't want me to candy coat it.
Right.
So I said, I'm really sorry to hear about the death of your father.
Yeah.
And he said, thank you for saying death.
Wow.
He said, you knew I would want that. He actually said that.
Man.
But I figure I've gotten it wrong sometimes. Because it's always a guessing game.
Yeah, sure.
But that's what I do. I try to read the other person. What would they want, given what I know of their personality?
Right, yeah.
And that dilemma never really comes into play if you were talking about like some sort of historical figures.
Exactly, right. Abraham Lincoln died. We don't have to say, and probably wouldn't say past, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's... Here's just something I see in obituaries sometime, and I want to know what y'all's experience has been, you know, with this. And to me, it's a beautiful phrase, but I don't quite know what it means. But it's, you'll see in an obituary, Joe Blow went to sleep in Jesus. Went to sleep in Jesus.
I don't know if I've ever heard
That's
that.
a new one on me, but I love it. Went to sleep in Jesus.
It's a new one on y'all.
We're going to have to write the song
That
now.
is incredible, y'all. Because honestly, I know in obituaries, I've seen that, you know, in local here, somebody went to sleep in Jesus.
That is a different way of putting it.
Isn't that so? I had no idea that this would be something y'all wouldn't, because y'all had a more, you know, you had a more fundamental upbringing than I grew up an Episcopalian, you know, in Gulfport, and we weren't talking about people going to sleep in Jesus, but y'all's people weren't either. Okay, man.
You know, we heard a number of these strange phrases when our dad was in the funeral business, as he was for a long time.
They're like taking their heavenly rest.
Right.
And I remember one that I liked. This funeral home had it on a business card. This business card was just a treat. It had giant letters, capital R, capital E, capital W. Mm-hmm. And then down below that, it told you what that stood for: royalty, excellency, and worthiness. And I don't know if these were qualities of the funeral home or of the dead or the bereft or what. And then down below that, it said specializing in families without burial insurance. And then down below that, it said helping you with your sweet transition since 1976. It almost finishes as if I myself have been dying since 76. I started in 76.
At least it's been a sweet transition because it's been a long one, man.
It's long but sweet. Sort of like, makes me think of you, Johnny. You know, that thing we were talking about last podcast about how when you misremember something like a line from literature, you're editing it.
Right.
There was a great example of that. And one day, Eric, we were in class. Johnny was teaching a American literature class, and we were talking about Huck Finn. That was a memorable class period. You said a few things that I've just cherished. Mm-hmm. One was, we were in the middle of talking about this, and Johnny says, very seriously, he says, I don't know if y'all know this, but the 19th century in America simply occurred in black and white. And then he just moved on from that and just let that dangle in the air. We were talking about Huck Finn. He said, shh, don't tell anybody. I think this is better than Homer's Odyssey. I think Homer's Odyssey is fantastic. But Huck Finn goes him one better on this journey story thing. And so I think this is a better version of that tale. I'll take Huck Finn over Homer's Odyssey. And then we got to the part where Huck, I believe in Arkansas, somewhere in the Arkansas Delta, encounters a copy of Pilgrim's Progress.
Yeah. It is in Arkansas, I think, yeah.
And Johnny said, I love what Huck says. The statements was tough, but interesting. I want it to be that. And I think it may be interesting, but tough.
You are right, because I remember being almost chagrined because I so reversed them so strongly. You know, that reminds me of another great line. And when Huck Finn goes over at one point, this girl is trying to get a letter back. She's written a love letter to a guy that she isn't supposed to, because her family's having a feud. And Huck Finn is going back to the church to try to get this letter out of the Bible. And And there's some hogs who have gotten into the church and on these punching floors, and there are 2 or 3 of them just really enjoying just being in the church. And so Finn says, yeah, people are, they're kind of iffy about going to church. They're not completely happy, they're not completely happy when they're in a church, but a hog is different. Oh
And,
my God! A hog is different.
Our same Mimi that taught me about the simples, she had these steps, and if you exited her house under the carport, you had to go down 2 or 3 steps.
Uh-huh.
And they were a little steep,
Yeah.
And as she got older, that became a little bit perilous. And one day I remember she stepped out on there and got a little dizzy. And she said, "Oh, boy, I'm cutting shinos." And I said, "You're what?" She said, "I'm cutting shinos. Let me get my balance here." And I said, "What do you mean cutting shinos?" She's like, "Oh, kind of dancing around, kind of cutting some dance moves." And I said, "I love that, Mimi. That's such a great phrase. Did you make that up?" And she goes, "Yeah, I made that up." Well, then, by and by, I encountered The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and started reading it. And he uses the expression cutting shines, and it obviously means the same thing.
Oh, great.
And so I went and showed her. I was like, "Mimi, I'm not saying you lied to me. Maybe you thought you made this up. Now, you did. You may have innovated with that O sound at the end, but doesn't it seem like he's saying the same thing here with cutting shines? Were you just pulling my leg?" And she's like, "Lord, honey, I thought I made that up, but I guess maybe."
And there's something, I was thinking of a story that is something that we were talking about, reminding me of earlier. And this was an expression, a really, rude expression I grew up with, or that I heard in junior high. And I've actually told this story to classes of mine, and it seems to me to be a word that doesn't happen anymore. I don't run into it in reading. I certainly don't hear anybody say it. But what it was, and what some wicked 7th grader taught me, or some guys in junior high were just going around saying the word mother huncher. Do y'all ever hear that word?
That to me seems like a euphemistic version of the other one.
Oh, of the other one, right? Yeah, but
I've never heard it.
But in my time, it was really, it would get you sent to the principal's office. Mother huncher, and so some guys were using it, but I didn't know what it meant. But I could tell that it was something off limits, something I oughtn't be saying. So I go home that day, knowing that, but not knowing maybe how strong it was, and so we're at the dinner table, and I looked at my brother, and I said, "Richard, you're a mother huncher." And my dad looked at me like, "What did you just say?" And then I kept going. I turned to my grandmother, and I said, "Bella, you're a mother huncher." And my dad said, "Son, come away from this table." And he took me off, and he chastised me, and he said, "Son, do you know what that means?" And he was really angry at me. But at that moment, I didn't want to have my father's displeasure, He was not a man who beat his children or anything, but, when he was displeased, he could make you wish you hadn't displeased him, And so I didn't want that, but I wanted even less to be ignorant. And so when he said, "Do you know what that means?" I just said, "Yes, sir." I could have gotten off the hook. I could have told the truth. And the truth was, "No, sir, I don't know what that means. I heard it on the playground, and I just wanted to use it." But when I said, "Yes, sir," he punished me in some way or other. I don't remember what.
It felt as harsh on the ear as the MF.
As what you're thinking of. You're thinking of it as a euphemism. But boy, when I grew up, that was not the feel it had for me.
Well, it is kind of more vulgar.
Yeah.
If you think about it.
Yeah.
I think we grew up with a euphemistic version. There's a kind of poignant moment because sometimes these words drop out of parlance.
Mm-hmm.
We knew we were among the last to hear this euphemism. It was too old time. Mm-hmm. It was going away. And one day we were out practicing basketball on a Saturday morning. My high school basketball team was practicing, and we were scrimmaging. Mm-hmm. And there'd been this fast break. The guy who had the ball was going for a layup, and they couldn't stop him because he was so daggum fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so somebody just reached out and slapped him because they couldn't get down there to make a good defensive play on the ball. So he got called for the foul, and that dude was up there shooting free throws. We lined up, and getting our position to block out. And somebody was taunting the guy who fouled him. He's like, you couldn't catch up to him. He's too fast for you. And that guy goes, yeah, he's one fast motor scooter. Everybody busted out laughing. Everybody was like, motor scooter. Everybody knew this is something we've heard our dads or grandpas say. And there was just this feeling, we will never say this unironically, and it's going to be gone from local parlance in like 10 years. No one will be saying it in a generation. And we were enjoying the comedy. We could experience it in a way that our fathers and grandfathers couldn't.
Right.
And sure enough, I don't think I've heard anybody use motor scooter like that in 15 years probably.
Right.
He was one bad motor scooter.
Motor scooter.
Did you hear that one, Johnny?
No, I didn't. Y'all just introduced me to something brand new.
I wonder if that was just around our area that was used.
Pumpkin Bend has a phrase I've never heard anywhere else. People in McCrory, where we went to school, which is 7 or 8 miles away, do not know this phrase. Only people from Pumpkin Bend, it seems. And it's heeny horse. You know how if you say, don't have a cow, like get really exercised over something?
Don't have a heeny horse. Have y'all, did y'all grow up with the expression hissy fit?
Yeah, I've heard that.
Okay, yeah.
Conniption?
Yeah, conniption, yeah, right. One thing that has struck me about a word, when I was a boy in the 50s, something that could get you sent to the principal's office and maybe expelled was to say the word suck, as in that sucks. And I think it was because it was somehow more closely moored to the sexual thing that we might mean by that, so that you could get in trouble at Ouachita and get people mad at you if you added something, to sucks, like what got sucked, But this was strange to me because I was acculturated enough in the 50s as a kid in Gulfport to what a really off-color word that was and get you sent to the principal. I get to Ouachita, among these nice Baptist kids, and one day a guy named Chris Oken said, that poem sucks. and it really shocked me. And I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be mad at the kid, but I was actually shocked. And then I gradually began realizing that sucked had come back. It felt to me almost like it had gone underground. But when it came back as something anybody can say. And I mean, we say it right and left at Washington ever since. And I use it too. It's lost all of that oomph it had for me in the 50s. And that's just, to me, a classical example of a word. In linguistics, we call it amelioration. It's just, it gets unoffensive, and, we can just say it.
Well, me and Eric had an experience one time related to this. We played in a band out in Charleston, South Carolina. Our bandmates, one of the guys was from New Jersey originally, and the other guy was from Charleston. And the guy from Charleston's name was Shank. And one day, something unfortunate was happening at a gig, and we got to talking about expressions that could register that sense of this is an unfortunate situation. And Shank was like, yeah, like this blows. And Eric was like, yeah, that's a good one. Like this blows a goat. He's like, blows a goat? Shank's like, blows a goat? He's like, I think the goat part's some Arkansas perversity you brought into it.
Oh my God.
Never heard that one before.
Oh my gosh.
That was, that was a bridge too far for Shank.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful.
Oh man, that dude cracked me up. You'd go over to his house and he would have like 4 different drinks. He'd have like some Kool-Aid and some milk and a Coke and maybe a beer. And it's like, dude, what are you doing, man? He's like, well, I want a little taste of all these at the same time. I can't decide. So, but he did this a lot, where he had various drinks just because he couldn't decide on just one.
My gosh.
Just hilarious. Greg, have you ever told Johnny the story about, I don't know if we should tell it, but Jim Bill?
In the 4th grade, there was this kid, classmate of mine named Jim Bill Patterson. And Jim Bill didn't do his homework at all. And so in class, he was always struggling.
Right.
When the teacher would call on him, he was never prepared. And she was not a sanguine sort to begin with, anytime she had to interact with Jim Bill. And my seat was situated so that when she had her face up to the blackboard writing, I could still see her face in profile. I could see what was happening there.
Right.
And one day she was teaching us about the backward Z method, as she called it, which was cross, multiply, and divide.
Okay.
This was utterly lost on Jim Bill. I mean, he hadn't paid attention. He hadn't done any of his homework. I like Jim Bill, by the way. He was cool, but it was her job to hold his feet to the fire. So anyway, she put a problem up on the board. Didn't even turn to face the class. Had the chalk up there against the blackboard ready to start writing. And she hadn't called on Jim Bill all day, and she felt this obligation to involve him, even though she knew, would have bet the farm and her future on the fact that he ain't going to be ready to answer this. So I saw her face. The anger had colonized her features. And there she was. All right, what's the first step? Jim Bill. She waits, doesn't turn. And he's like, oh no. Did you do your homework, Jim Bill? Did you do the drills? No, ma'am. Have you ever done your homework? Have you ever done the drills? I don't think so. I don't remember if I did. And I was like, what is about to happen? I thought I was going to witness a beating. I didn't know what was about to happen.
Serious honesty from Jim Bill.
And finally, after giving it a moment or two of thought, she turned around and looked at him and she said, Jim Bill, son, one of these days in life, you're going to have to make a decision. It's either going to be Jim or it's going to be Bill. But you can't go through life as Jim Bill Patterson.
I didn't see that coming.
No
Greg.
one did. God did
see
not see that one coming.
That is so wonderful.
Like you're going to have to decide. It can't be both.
None of us knew what to say or do. But the laugh's on her. Because Jim Bill's Jim Bill to this day. He's going to go to the grave as Jim Bill.
I wonder what possessed her to say that. That was so genius in a
just
way,
a hilarious
man.
story.
I remember telling some people at Ouachita about that, and this one lady was like, that reminds me of my high school friend, Nick Tom.
Nick
Oh
Tom.
my
There's
God.
something about these spondaic, like
Yeah,
Jim Bill,
Jim Bill.
Dick Toms.
Whenever someone does have two names like that, I wonder sometimes, should I say both or just the first one?
Well, usually it's a trochee. The first one, I used to joke that there should be a Southern girl named Trochee Jane because basically any trochaic girl name has a Jane after it, or or a May or a Lou or something. Trochee Lou, Trochee May. If you have that trochee like Sarah Jane or Katie Lou, if that's the rhythm, but it's something about the double punch of that Jim Bill or Nick Tom. It just is like makes you feel off balance or something.
You're saying the word trochee reminds me of something wonderfully funny Alex Taylor said to me in a letter the other day. I'm teaching a course called English Studies, and I inherited the books from Ben Utter, just my wonderful colleague. And one of them is the book I got Jay on years ago, that Paul Fussel's Poetic Form and Meter. And I really, I like the book. I respect the book. But I know my students are struggling with it. It's a pretty sophisticated book, and these kids, so I don't know about teaching, but I'm doing the best I can with it, But anyway, I happened to make some passing reference to that in a letter to Alex. And Alex says, he writes back and says, I think that's a wonderful book. I really do. He said, but I tried to use that book in a class one time, and my students looked at me like I'd put my socks in their coffee. And I started telling my students that. I said, I just wanted we had Fussels sometime earlier this week, and I said, did y'all kind of feel like I put my socks in your coffee? They were looking at me like, we don't know,
That's like I saw a country preacher one time at the Hickory Ridge Assembly of God Church. He was preaching one of those fiery flourishes, and he's kind of losing the crowd because it was so harsh, and he wasn't getting those amens and preach it, brother, and all that. He was going. I mean, it was real loud and fast paced. And all of a sudden, he just stopped, and man, the silence. It was a profound silence that you felt once he stopped on a dime right in the mid flourish.
Right.
And he goes, "What's the matter, church? Looked like you just got hit in the face with a wet squirrel." It's so weird. A wet squirrel.
God.
Under what circumstances would you be?
That's genius. That's genius on that guy's part. I mean, the things people can come up with.
I went and gave a reading last year at Morehead State where Alex teaches. And did I tell you about talking to his students?
I don't think so.
I got some time with one of his best students. This guy's pretty sharp. And I was like, oh, he's going to have the dirt / the goods on Alex. So I said, why don't you tell me some stories about A-Tay, the professor, because I just think of him as my old friend, a writer I admire and a good friend, but what's he like as a teacher? And this guy goes, well, I remember one time he come into class holding an orange. And he had his book satchel in one hand and an orange in the other hand. And he didn't even get over to his desk till somebody raised their hand and asked him a question. And it was one of them silly questions that you don't even know why somebody would ask it. And it's like, it's like, how many poems did Dorothy Wordsworth write? The number. About that time, Professor Taylor, he just hauled off and threw that orange at the wall as hard as he could. He said he's always had the illusion that the orange stuck to the wall for a second before it rolled down.
Oh, my God.
And then after the orange had rolled down the wall, A-Tay turned to the class and said, expect the unexpected.
That guy. Oh, my gosh.
Oh, man. I've heard quite a few of Alex stories with you.
Yeah, man.
One thing I've been meaning to ask you, though, Johnny, about the place you said in China that y'all saw that the fourth floor was named after a word that was too close to die. Or
Yeah. So there just wouldn't be a fourth floor. You'd have 1, 2, 3, and 5.
My question is, though, if you're on the 5th floor, is that not pretty, like, I don't know if that would fool me.
Deep down, you'd know.
It's like, you can't just remove this floor.
You can't fool the cosmos. That's good.
Man, telling yourself it's floor 5 just makes it even more noticeable in your spirits.
Yeah.
Now you've given it the power by trying to dodge it.
That's
it's like,
right.
it's like, this isn't really 5.
Yeah.
It's 4.
Oh, my gosh. I wonder, probably it's true, too. Probably Chinese people themselves have been haunted by that very thought, man.
I just kept thinking that because I was like,
Yeah.
I would just avoid the real floor 4. I wouldn't try to remove it from the language, just even though it's still there. You know?
Yeah. But if y'all ever, I mean, I don't guess this happens anymore, but I do think that there were times in the history of our country in buildings that are more than 13 stories where
I've heard that.
Yeah, there actually wasn't a 13th story. Although Eric's proved there was, of course, one, and we just call it the 14th one. Yeah.
Just make you feel better there. Yeah. Greg, did you ever tell Johnny the story about going to Walmart and doing the interviews? One of the crazy things that Greg does, he's always pulling these jokes, but he takes me to Walmart with him, and he gets me to carry a briefcase. We were in our 20s probably. You might have been in high school.
Yeah.
But anyway, Greg involved me in this, and I'm like carrying a briefcase to look like there's something important in this, like I'm a part of this crackpot, like journalist team. And Greg's, the whole thing he does is he just randomly comes up to strangers at Walmart, and he made up a fictitious name of some paper that he worked for, and he kept going up to people and being like, ma'am, would you mind if I have just a moment of your time? I work for whatever the name of this place is. He goes, we really wanted to take a poll, and we felt like that Walmart was a really good place to get a diverse audience, because everybody has to come to Walmart, but it's an important poll. We want to get some information, but yeah, like I said, and he would just, the joke was, all he would do is talk about how Walmart was a great place to get a variety of people's ideas about these burning questions that are going to be in the paper. But all he did was he just kept talking about how Walmart was a great place until the person either just walked off, or like he never got to the question. It was all.
Did anybody ever say, well, what is the question?
Oh, yeah, they tried and tried. And I was like, we're getting to that. But I just wanted to make it clear that I just because you get a cross section of the population out here at Walmart. I've seen people in fancy, expensive clothes and expensive haircuts. But I've also seen just, poor folks. So do you agree? I mean, this is a good place. This would be a good place to, and how long can because people are so polite,
Especially in Arkansas.
And they'll just go with you for an absurdly long period of time.
Right.
And finally, some people would just walk off.
It took everything I had to keep a straight face.
Man, gosh.
That reminds me of a time that I'll just get a wacky thought and say something outrageous. And actually, it was when I first met my kid's mom. And I told her, I said, I've never really confided in anyone about this outside our family, but I was born with a tail. And she was like, "Oh, no, you're not." And I was like, "No, that's really a thing. Like sometimes people are born with tails and they have to cut it off." But I was like, my mom was really weird, and like she insisted on like keeping it in a jar. So like we still have my tail in a jar of formaldehyde at home in Pumpkin Bend. And she's like, "No." I was like, "You can call my brother out now and ask him." And I just saying this to her, knowing that if she calls Greg and asks this question, even though Greg knows nothing about this,
of course,
he's going to confirm this for me.
He was always there for you, man.
Always.
Oh man!
But sure enough, so she calls and Greg without hesitation, she's like, "Greg, was Eric born with a tail that y'all keep in a jar of embalming fluid or something?" And Greg's like, "Oh yeah, with no hesitation,
Of
just
course.
like
We had it pickled right there on the counter for years.
Of course, yeah. And that's the beauty of it for you guys, and it's always been for me too. Like with my son, he's as good at this as anybody. He's no better than Greg, but he's as good. And another guy that is, I mean, if I have a ball to toss, you knew you could depend on Greg, and you knew you could depend on him. You know, not only to go along with you, but to do these wonderful embellishments of what you were going. And it's like you hand off to him and he's going to run 75 yards. And that's the way I always feel about my son. If we get into a setting with someone, you know, and another great one on this, Greg, is Joe Graves, my friend, the actor, you know, and then Jack Butler.
Gigolo.
And Jack Butler is just, and somebody else who I'm beginning to realize is just going to be a great partner in this for as long as I'm still alive and partnering with people and stuff, is Eli Crater. Yeah.
I sure thought Jack Butler was messing with me one night. When
Really?
He came to Jonesboro.
Yeah.
And
But he wasn't.
I don't know Jack at all.
Uh-huh.
But we went to the little recording studio I had, and we just played some music, and he recited some of his poems over the music, which was really cool. And then we got back to my little tiny apartment I was living in. It was just the three of us. I think he was there for the Delta Blues symposium or something. And anyway, so we're just having this conversation in my living room, and like right in the middle of this just normal conversation, Jack starts doing yoga poses, but like he just like got one leg stuck straight up in the air, or like laid and contorting his body around, and he's totally straight faced, keeps the conversation going. It made me like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
What in the world is happening?
Gosh.
I had some insight into it because he had been in Arkadelphia not long before this to give a reading over at Henderson. And then you and he and I went back to y'all's house, and Susan had cooked.
Right. Yeah.
And while she was putting the finishing touches on the meal, he was doing yoga. And he said, "You know, I've just been watching kids lately, and they just move, you know. They move how they want to move.
Yeah.
And I want to be more like that. And so I've just decided I'm not going to be inhibited about it anymore." So I knew what was going on, that it was
I'll be. I'd forgotten that.
that was a sweet night, you know.
Yeah, it was.
I remember Susan started to describe something that had happened when y'all had all lived in Fayetteville.
Right.
And then she started tearing up. And then Jack got up from his yoga pose and went over there and put his arm around her and said, "I feel that old time coming on."
Yeah, I kind of remember that. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Well, one thing, this may be too long, but I kind of know your flow, but I was wondering with you, Johnny, like if you said you get like a word or something, and it's a kind of a beginning point for a poem.
Right.
How do you go about that process? Like if you get like just one idea, is it?
Yeah, Eric, for me, and lately this is a kind of a routine I have in my life now. You know, I'm a widower, and so I live alone, and I'm living with one cat now, and I find that's all right. You know, I don't have a desire to live with somebody else, you know, or to get remarried or anything like that. But I mean, at the same time, I cherish. I mean, like what's happening to me right now, being with you two guys, it couldn't be better, you know. And just so grateful for y'all and your presence in my life and your presence in this, and our just going back and forth. And what happens is I'll go to bed at night, and I pack into the bed, you know, 5 or 6 books, and some of them are school books because I got to get up and go teach something, you know. And I always then have a notebook, and some of the books aren't school books. I'm just reading them for the heck of it, you know. So I got my black cat Silhouette, who's usually in bed with me, and the notebook. And what happens to me is that what gets me started writing these days is reading. I mean, I can be reading a student's composition, and all of a sudden I'm writing something, and it may not even have anything to do with what I was, just some chancy thing, the way it's happened for us today. And this, it makes me happy to know I'm going to wake up in the morning and I'm going to be scribbling in that notebook, and it's going to be a mixture of things. Some of them are going to be things that I'll come and try to turn into a writing. And I don't try to publish my writing anymore. There was a time when I was kind of zealous to do that, and I've lost interest in that. But I love to write these things and like send something to Greg or Jack Butler or Beth Polo or just something I've written that, you know. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very pleasant thing for me now to be doing this. But I know that, man, what will get me writing more than any is just reading something, and then a word comes into my mind. And these days, for me at least, if something's going to get me started, it's almost certainly going to be reading somebody else and then going off from there to Lord knows where.
And you're so open to whatever that text happens to be. That's how your poem about the Grim Stubble period happened. You were reading the rules and regs.
And I really had a kind of a point. I mean, that was a comic poem, but I was also really wanting to point out how disgusted I was with those people. You know, here these people, you know, who are basically in the world of built people, you know, by playing on gambling weaknesses. But man, they want their workers
clean cut.
I mean, clean cut, and there was all sorts of other stuff in that thing about you must be above boredom, this, and this, you know. Oh, man.
You may not be able to work at a casino during the Grim Stubble period, but apparently you can be on a podcast. Eric has proved that tonight.
Yeah.
Beyond a 5 o'clock shadow of a doubt.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure, guys. I mean, this has been great. Yeah.
Thanks so much, fellas.
Man.
Such a joy.
Glad to be
hang
here.
with y'all.
Yeah. I mean, I really kind of thought after last time, I thought this was just about as good as it gets, but this was a little better.
This was awfully
We got
loud.
Eric in here, man.
I just had a feeling this was going to work.
I could tell too, just but the last time I was listening to that last one of y'all's, I was the whole time I'm just like kicking things off in my head. You know?
Oh, man.
All right, fellas. Till next time.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, man.